Hey guys, in this video I'm going to talk about dynamic memory in Hyper-V. We'll see what are the use cases of dynamic memory and how to configure it. So what is dynamic memory? Dynamic memory is a Hyper-V memory management feature which automatically reallocates the memory among virtual machines efficiently. So when you enable memory on a Hyper-V virtual machine, the memory is treated as a shared resource, which means other virtual machines can also use that memory if required. So for example, when a virtual machine needs more memory due to performance reasons or other factors, and if the Hyper-V host sees a virtual machine with idle memory, and if dynamic memory is enabled on both the virtual machines, the one that requires more memory and the one that has idle memory, then Hyper-V host can easily adjust the amount of memory needed to the virtual machine based on the memory demand and the available memory on the Hyper-V host. So this is true with almost all virtual machines running in any environment. So when they are not doing anything, their current memory usage will be very low against the configured memory. But when they are running some jobs, they tend to use more memory and sometimes more than the configured memory. And with the help of dynamic memory, you can now run more virtual machines on the Hyper-V host. You can do over provisioning with respect to the memory available on the host. Dynamic memory is also very beneficial in environment that have many idle or low load virtual machines such as a pooled VDI environments. Dynamic memory is also useful in environment where you don't want to spend money for additional memory and would like to save memory on the host. Alright, now there are some workloads for which you should not use dynamic memory. So it is recommended to not to set dynamic memory for the virtual machines running Microsoft SQL or Exchange. It is because SQL and Exchange will consume all the available memory that the host has to offer, even the maximum memory growth that you can define in dynamic memory options. So it does not make any sense to use dynamic memory for virtual machines running SQL or Exchange. And here are the operating system that supports dynamic memory. We have Linux distributions and we have Windows servers starting from Server 2003 Service Pack 2 till Windows Server 2012 R2. They all support dynamic memory. Now one thing that you have to note is that you have to install the latest integration services after you set up the operating system in the virtual machine. Alright, let's do some demo. Let me show you how you can configure dynamic memory on a virtual machine. So I'll right click on a virtual machine server 02 and click settings, and I'll click on memory. So I have this 2 GB of startup RAM configured on it. So when this VM powers on, 2 GB of RAM is reserved for this VM on the host. So regardless of what the actual RAM demand is, the host will reserve this for the virtual machine. And this is the place where you enable dynamic memory. It is just a checkbox that you need to enable. I've already enabled it, and if your virtual machine is up and running, then you need to shut down the virtual machine to enable this option. Otherwise this option would be grayed out. Now after enabling dynamic memory, you should be able to specify the minimum and maximum RAM for a virtual machine. So minimum RAM is where you specify how much of minimum memory your virtual machine need to have. So I have 512 MB for this virtual machine. I know we said we need 2 GB of startup memory, but here we are saying that we just need 512 MB of minimum memory. The logic is that when an operating system starts up initially, it requires certain amount of memory, but when it has actually started up and running, then it doesn't require that much. So once the virtual machine notifies the host that its RAM requirement has decreased, then the host will start reclaiming the idle memory allocated to the virtual machine. But from the operating system's perspective, running on the virtual machine, the amount of visible RAM will never drop down below the startup RAM amount. So I have a 2 GB of startup RAM for this virtual machine, and if I open up the operating system of this virtual machine, the operating system of this virtual machine will also say that it has 2 GB as the total RAM. Let me come back to the virtual machine settings. Now the good thing is that you can increase the maximum RAM while the virtual machine is running. You can do this in Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V or later. But we were not able to do this in Windows Server 2008 R2 Hyper-V or prior. Also, another thing is that with minimum RAM, you cannot increase it, but you can decrease it when the virtual machine is running. And with the maximum RAM, you can increase it, but you cannot decrease it. So let me show you that. So the minimum RAM that we have set for this virtual machine is 512 MB. So if I try to increase by 2 MB and if I click apply, it says you cannot decrease the maximum memory or increase the minimum memory while the virtual machine is running or paused. But I can always, come back and I can decrease the minimum RAM. All right, there you go. I clicked apply, and with maximum RAM you cannot decrease it, so I'll bring it down by 2 MB and I'll click apply, and it says the same thing, but I can increase by 2 MB the maximum RAM. I'll click apply. All right, there you go. And by default, the value for the maximum RAM will be set to 1 TB, and I don't have that much of memory on my host. And moreover, it is not recommended that you leave this value set to the default. So I have specified the maximum RAM that this VM can have is 4 GB. The next option you can set is memory buffer. By default it is set to 20%, but we can always change that, and by changing the value we are asking the Hyper-V host to reserve 20% of configured memory of the VM as a buffer. So if this virtual machine's memory is configured with 2 GB, then we are asking the Hyper-V host to reserve 20% of 2 GB, which is 400 MB of memory. In our case, we'll leave this to default. And the next option is memory weight. This option is useful if there is a memory contention among the virtual machines running on this host. With memory weight option, you can specify which virtual machine can get more or less priority during memory contention on the host. So if I specify low as the memory weight priority for this virtual machine, then it might not start up if the available memory on the host is low and other virtual machines are already running, and it is also used for taking memory away. The lower the weight, the most likely the machine is to lose memory when the host needs it. The higher the priority when it comes to giving out the memory to the VM. I'm going to set this to default and I'll click cancel on this. It is also important that you monitor dynamic memory in Hyper-V, and there are quite a few ways to do that. Using System Center Virtual Machine Manager, SCVMM gives the most complete view of the dynamic RAM picture. In this picture, you can see that there are varying amounts of assigned RAM to the 3 virtual machines. FastView 01 is currently demanding 2 GB of RAM. The assigned amount is the demand plus the memory buffer. FastView 02 is currently only demanding 1.28 GB since it is a smaller workload. The assigned memory, however, is still 2 GB because this is the specified minimum RAM amount. FastView 03 is currently assigned only with 1.27 GB of RAM. It has the smallest workload of all. The difference is that the minimum RAM specified is 512 MB. So the SEVMM view is great because it is a complete and provides you with the total picture. It does, however, lag a little behind. So the best place for more live statistics are in the Hyper-V Management Console. So here you can see the Hyper-V Management Console. So the Hyper-V Management Console provides a simple and convenient real-time view of the RAM assignment. But it is still not a great tool to determine the memory baseline for your virtual machines, but it can show you things like how much is your startup memory, whether dynamic memory is enabled or not, the minimum and the maximum memory configured for the virtual machine, assigned memory allocated to the virtual machine by the host, the current memory demand by the virtual machine, and whether the memory status is okay or not. The other way to monitor dynamic memory usage is to use performance monitor on the host itself. You can get a very detailed live view of the dynamic memory picture. The key counters are to use Hyper-V Dynamic Memory Balancer and Hyper-V Dynamic Memory VM. The Hyper-V Memory Balancer counter gives you a view of how the host is doing from a memory perspective. So in this image below, the host still has 4.5 GB of RAM available to allocate based on the demand. And the current demand or pressure from the virtual machine is around 80. And when the pressure gets to 100, the host is essentially out of RAM. The dynamic memory VM counter gives you a view very similar to what we have seen from the SCVMM and Hyper-V management console. One counter that is useful here is the guest visible physical memory. This indicates how much RAM the virtual machines has visible, and it also indicates the RAM demand. And also perfmon gives you an advantage of being able to track the RAM allocation on a graph. So if you need to do capacity planning and would like to know how much memory is available on the host, then you need to use the performance counter Hyper-V Dynamic Memory Balancer, and the counter is available memory, and it determines how much memory you can safely allocate to create new virtual machines. So it shows the available memory in MB, and in this example you can see that the host still has around 4.5 GB of memory available. So let's do another demo. Let's see how we can monitor the dynamic memory usage in the virtual machines. So I have a VM with Windows 8.1 Server 02, and the startup memory is configured with 2 GB of RAM, and dynamic memory is also enabled. Minimum memory is half a gig and maximum memory is 4 GB. So let's go ahead and power on the VM. I'll right click on it, click start, and I'll open the console. When the VM is powered on, I'll open up Task Manager and the RAM map as well. In the Task Manager, I'll click on Performance and I'll click on Memory. And you can see that the memory usage is around 30%, which is 0.6 GB. And in the RAM map, you can see that the unused is around 1 GB.